So this is an illustration of how the steroid hormones work. So you can see that the steroid hormones can actually move directly through the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. They don't bind to a receptor on the surface. So they move into the nucleus and they bind to a receptor in the nucleus and then to DNA, and they affect genes directly. So that's really the difference in the steroid versus the peptide hormones is how they interact with their target cell, and the effects of the steroid hormone last longer, but it also takes longer to cause its effects. Okay, moving on to the next section. This is on the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus produces releasing and inhibiting hormones. And then the pituitary gland is divided into the posterior and the anterior. So we'll start with the posterior pituitary. It produces ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And what this hormone does is shut down the release. It says controlled by negative feedback. Okay, so this is hard to understand. What this means is that there is a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus that stimulates the release of ADH. So it's controlled by that. So ADH, what it actually does is it causes you to retain water. A diuretic, like caffeine is a diuretic, is a natural diuretic, causes you to produce a large volume of urine and cause you to release a lot of water. So antidiuretic is going to cause you to retain water. And then oxytocin is produced by the posterior pituitary, and that is controlled by positive feedback. Basically, when you start having labor, chemicals are released, and the labor contractions stimulate you to release more oxytocin, and that causes your contractions to be stronger, which stimulates even more oxytocin release. And this happens, and it goes on until you have the baby. So here's a picture of the anterior pituitary and the posterior. And the posterior pituitary is stimulated by the nervous system, basically. Because once you start having labor contractions, for example, that those impulses are sent to your hypothalamus, and that will trigger the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin, which will increase your contractions, and it'll just keep on and on like that. But there are cells called neurosecretory cells that produce ADH and oxytocin in the hypothalamus, and then those hormones move down this pathway here, the portal system, and will stimulate or trigger the posterior pituitary to release them. So ADH will affect the kidneys, and oxytocin will affect your uterine contractions and also the letdown of milk from the mammary glands. The anterior pituitary is controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. So the anterior produces TSH, ACTH, and then gonadotropic hormones that will stimulate the release of FSH and LH. So TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, and it will trigger the thyroid to release thyroid hormones to increase your metabolism. ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and it will stimulate your adrenal gland to release cortisol. And then your gonadotropic hormones are going to stimulate the release of FSH and LH, which have to do play roles in the female reproductive cycles, the menstrual cycle, and the ovulation. And so also FSH and LH play a role in egg production and release, and also the production of sperm and release of sperm. Now, here's some other anterior pituitary hormones. Prolactin, which stimulates the production of milk in the mammary glands. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, which stimulates your melanocytes to release melanin, and growth hormone, or GH, which stimulates growth. And these from the anterior pituitary are shown here: TSH, ACTH, PRL or prolactin, GH, and then gonadotropic hormones FSH and LH. And it shows you basically how the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary works. Basically, the hypothalamus will produce and release a hormone called a releasing hormone. Like, for example, TRH is thyroid releasing hormone. And that will cause the anterior pituitary to release its hormone, which is, in this case is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And then TSH will attach to receptors on cells of the thyroid, and it will cause the thyroid cells to release thyroid hormone, which are called T3 and T4. And that will cause us to, our metabolism to raise. Now, the feedback is that the more thyroid hormone, the more T3 and T4 is in the circulation, that will cause the hypothalamus not to releasing hormone. Okay, so that's the negative feedback part of it. This slide is showing you a disease called acromegaly, which affects adults, and it has to do with growth hormone production in adults. This is not children. So you can see that the difference in the hand of someone with acromegaly versus a normal hand. Definitely the larger joints. There's excess growth going on in this person's hand. Okay, so about the thyroid gland, what you need to know is it is located just below the larynx. It's attached to the trachea, and it's just below the larynx. And it produces these hormones, triiodothyronine and thyroxine, which we're just going to call thyroid hormones. They're T3 and T4 for short, but we call them thyroid hormones, and they increase metabolism and cause most of the body cells to metabolize or carry out chemical reactions at a faster rate. And the thyroid actively acquires iodine to produce T3 and T4. So these hormones require iodine, which is why we see iodized salt, trying to make sure everybody has enough iodine. Okay, so some thyroid-induced abnormalities. Sometimes you'll see a person who has a goiter in their neck, and that just means that comes from poor production of thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Sometimes there is congenital hypothyroidism or cretinism. That can come from iodine deficiencies in the pregnant mother, or it can be genetic. Then there's hypothyroidism, which is decreased production of thyroid hormone. It's when it occurs when the immune system produces antibodies that destroy the thyroid gland. Untreated hypothyroidism results in myxedema, this will lead to lethargy, being very tired all the time, weight loss, loss of hair, slow heart rate, lowered body temperature, thickness and puffiness in the skin, just different symptoms like that. But I will tell you, sometimes hypothyroidism can lead to weight gain. A slow thyroid can lead to weight gain too. But when it's untreated and it just never gets treated, it can eventually lead to weight loss. So it just depends on the stage you're at. Then a person with hyperthyroidism can also have Graves' disease. That can go hand in hand. But that is when they overproduce or oversecrete thyroid hormone. Graves' disease happens when antibodies stimulate the overproduction of T3 and T4. Instead of destroying the thyroid gland and slowing the production of thyroid hormone, this is when you have too much thyroid hormone. And you can have exophthalmos, which is the excessive protrusion of the eyes. You can see someone that kind of looks like bug eyes when they have Graves' disease. You can see that with this lady here, the eye that's affected. I've known people with Graves' disease, and they do have that appearance in their eyes. And this is what a child looks like who has congenital hypothyroidism. And this is a goiter in someone who has a goiter, and that's when occurs when their thyroid is underactive. Okay, the thyroid also produces a hormone called calcitonin, which is not related to our metabolism, but it does help regulate our levels of calcium ions in our blood, which are very important for nerve impulses and muscle contractions. So if those blood calcium levels are not balanced, if they're too high or too low, that can affect muscle contraction and it can affect nerve impulses, which is pretty important. So calcitonin is secreted by the thyroid gland when your blood calcium level rises. So what it does is it lowers blood calcium levels by affecting the activity of your bones, the cells in your bones. So what calcitonin does is it temporarily reduces the activity and the number of osteoclasts. These are cells that break down bone tissue and release calcium into the blood from the broken down bone tissue. So calcitonin helps to raise blood calcium levels. I'm sorry. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I don't want to re-record it, but I do need to say that again because that was a mistake. Blood calcium levels are lowered by calcitonin. And that they do that by reducing the activity of osteoclasts, which break down bone tissue and release calcium into the blood. So reducing the activity of these osteoclasts is going to help to lower your blood calcium levels. Now, the parathyroid glands, there are 4 of them, and they're on the posterior side of the thyroid, and they produce parathyroid hormone. So when you don't produce enough parathyroid hormone, or PTH, that will cause tetanus, which is basically your muscles lock up. And calcitonin and PTH are antagonistic hormones, so their actions are opposite. So if calcitonin lowers blood calcium levels, parathyroid hormone is going to raise blood calcium levels in various ways. And this is an image illustration of how the parathyroid hormone and calcitonin from the thyroid are used to regulate your blood calcium levels. So just remember that calcitonin from the thyroid will lower your blood calcium, and then parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands will raise your blood calcium levels. Then we have the adrenal glands. The inside of the adrenal glands, both of these glands sit on top of each kidney, but the inside is called the adrenal medulla, and it secretes epinephrine or adrenaline and norepinephrine or noradrenaline into the bloodstream, which has the effect of raising your heart rate and your breathing rate, and it will cause you to have higher blood sugar levels so that you get more glucose to your cells, so that you can function during an emergency. Then we have the adrenal cortex, which produces mineralocorticoids like aldosterone and glucocorticoids like cortisol. And you probably have heard of cortisol. It's the stress hormone. And this shows you the adrenal glands and their relationship to the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, because what happens is the hypothalamus will produce releasing hormone, and that will cause the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that will affect the release of the from the adrenal cortex. That will affect the release of cortisol, and it will cause the release of cortisol and aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And then it also shows you for the adrenal medulla how that works is through the nervous system and the hypothalamus. So stress will cause your hypothalamus to send a sympathetic nerve impulse to the adrenal medulla, and it will release epinephrine and norepinephrine. Cortisol is the stress hormone, and what it does is raise blood glucose levels, and it will counteract the inflammatory response. Aldosterone is also produced by the adrenal cortex. It is a mineralocorticoid, and it promotes the absorption of sodium, which will cause us to retain water. And it will help to raise our blood pressure, our blood volume, and our blood pressure. Then we have ANH, which is atrial natriuretic hormone, produced by the atrium of the heart, and it inhibits aldosterone secretion, and it causes the excretion of sodium ions. So they have opposite effects, in other words. Aldosterone, as well as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, both function to raise blood pressure by raising blood volume. And aldosterone does this by causing the kidneys to reabsorb sodium, which leads to water reabsorption. So we retain water, in other words. We retain water when we have aldosterone secretion. But with ANH, atrial natriuretic hormone, is going to be opposite. It's going to cause us to lose sodium ions when we urinate. So we're going to excrete them with our urine, and water is going to follow. So we will lose water whenever ANH is released, and that will cause us to our blood pressure to raise. Okay, some diseases. This starts with slide 30. So we'll start with slide 30 on the next recording, and talk about diseases of the endocrine system.